A veteran fixed an old engine in a shed on the town's edge. A teacher brought a thermos of coffee on a cold day to warm him. That simple kindness led to his firing. But by morning, his story spread nationwide, making his name known in the news. Hi everyone, welcome to Life Unveiled. Let's get started. James Carter lived on the outskirts of a small town in an old trailer with a leaning shed, where he spent his days tinkering with rusty engines. A veteran of 2 military campaigns, he'd returned home with hands that could fix anything and a heart that stayed silent about the past. Tall and broad-shouldered, he looked older than his 30-something years. Grey streaked his dark hair, and wrinkles carved by war lined his face. He kept to himself, avoiding people, his gaze often drifting to a horizon where explosions and screams lingered in memory. Emily Davis lived closer to the town's centre in a tidy house with a white picket fence and a creaky porch. In her 40s, she'd grown used to solitude, filling her days teaching history at the local school. With a gentle voice and auburn hair tied in a loose ponytail, she'd grown up in this town, knowing its streets and its people. But lately, she'd noticed James, a solitary figure in a worn jacket passing her house each morning. He never looked up, never spoke, yet she sensed a weight in his silence heavier than mere fatigue. One frosty November day, Emily glanced out her window and saw a thin wisp of smoke rising from James's shed on the town's edge. The sky was grey, the wind chasing dry leaves down the streets, and she figured he must be freezing out there alone. She brewed coffee, poured it into an old thermos with scratched edges, her father's old keepsake, and drove to him. The shed was cold, its concrete floor littered with spare parts, rusted bolts, and scraps of metal. James sat by an engine, his oil-stained fingers turning a wrench with care. Emily stepped in quietly, set the thermos on a crate beside him, and left without a word. James looked up, his brown eyes meeting hers for a moment, but he only nodded and went back to work. The next day, Emily found a paper bag at her doorstep. Inside were 2 muffins, lopsided, slightly burnt at the edges, but warm, baked by hands unaccustomed to ovens. She smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest, and knew it was his way of saying thanks. That's how their strange, wordless bond began. Every few days, Emily brought a thermos of coffee, left it by the shed, and walked away. James responded with baked goods, muffins, cinnamon rolls, or a chunk of bread from the old stove in his trailer. They didn't speak, didn't exchange more than glances, but this ritual became a thread tying their lives together. Emily started noticing small things, how he neatly stacked his tools, how his hands moved with precision despite a tremble that sometimes ran through them. She didn't know what he thought of her, but she felt her presence was shifting something in his isolation. But that small act of kindness soon turned into trouble. James worked at the town's garage, owned by Robert Hayes, a stingy man with a harsh demeanour. Robert was short, with greasy hair and lips always pursed tight, known for cutting corners, from parts to paychecks. He'd hired James years ago, valuing his military experience, but paid him less than the other mechanics. "You've got benefits, veteran," he'd grunt, handing James a thin stack of bills. James didn't argue. He needed the job to keep his mind busy, and silence had long been his shield. The garage was an aging building, paint peeling from its walls, oil stains pooling on the floor, but it buzzed with life. Cars humming, customers grumbling, and Robert counting cash in his cramped office. One day, a beat-up truck rolled into the garage with a busted engine, an old Ford, rusted through, its motor coughing like a sick old man. James took it on as a challenge. He spent the whole day there, pulling apart parts, cleaning valves, replacing gaskets. His movements carried the same precision that saved lives in war, fixing rigs under fire. By evening, the engine purred steadily, filling the shop with a smooth hum. Even the other mechanics, usually indifferent, nodded in approval. James wiped his hands on a rag and stepped aside, but Robert saw a chance to profit. He charged the client, Tom Bennett, double the fare rate, pocketing the extra cash. Tom, a loud guy with a red face and a booming voice, came back the next day, yelling that the engine died within an hour. He jabbed a finger at James, blaming him for shoddy work, while Robert stood by, nodding grimly. To save face, Robert fired James on the spot, barking, "You let us all down." He was kicked out into the cold, leaving behind his tools and the smell of oil that had been his world. It was blatant injustice. James had done flawless work, but he became the scapegoat for Robert's greed. The town buzzed with rumours. Some said the veteran had turned to drink. Others whispered he'd never been any good. His name, once unnoticed, now carried a stain. Emily heard about it in the school staff room where teachers gossiped over tea. The unfairness stung her, and she knew she had to act. That evening, she drove to the shed with another thermos, but James didn't even glance at it. He sat on a crate, staring at the floor, his hands still on his knees, surrounded by a silence thick as fog. Emily left the coffee and walked away, but she wouldn't give up. She decided she wouldn't let him drown in that loneliness. The next day, she returned with a basket of sandwiches, simple ones with ham and cheese she'd made that morning. James nodded, took one, but stayed quiet. Emily kept coming, bringing food, sometimes tools she'd borrowed from a mechanic friend at school. She didn't expect talk or thanks, just stayed present. James didn't push her away, and slowly, his shed came alive. Neighbours who'd heard of his skills started dropping off old cars, battered sedans, motorcycles with cracked frames. James fixed them silently, with the same care he'd once used in combat zones. Emily spread the word at school, among parents and staff, and soon the shed became a place where people sought not just repairs, but honesty. Everything shifted one day. Tom Bennett, the very client whose truck sparked the firing, rolled up to the shed in his old pickup. It had broken down on the highway, and Robert's garage had quoted a price that made him slam the door and leave, grumbling. Tom left the truck with James and came back the next morning. He started the engine and froze. It ran perfectly, no hint of its old troubles. James charged only for parts, a few bucks for spark plugs and oil. Tom stared, muttered an apology, shook James's hand, and drove off. He told his buddies, they told theirs, and soon people flocked to the shed. Orders piled up, and Emily stepped in, making a schedule, jotting down clients in a notebook she kept on a crate by the door. The shed turned into a small business, with James fixing engines and Emily keeping it running. Then came the unbelievable. A client who'd had James fix his motorcycle turned out to be a part-time journalist. He wrote a piece about the veteran who turned injustice into triumph and posted it online. The story exploded, about how James, thrown out of the garage, rebuilt himself in a shed, how a teacher with a thermos of coffee became his anchor. By the next morning, Emily's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from big city reporters. TV crews showed up at the shed, filming James in his worn jacket as he worked on an engine, Emily standing nearby with a quiet smile. They called him a hero, not just for the war, but for rising after a fall. The story hit national news, his name echoing across the country. People came not just to fix cars, but to shake his hand, to thank him for showing what resilience looks like. Robert's garage lost its customers. His scams unravelled, and it shut down, leaving him empty-handed. One warm spring evening, James and Emily sat outside the shed on mismatched chairs they'd salvaged from the junk pile. They shared that same thermos, now scratched and dented, filled with hot coffee. Around them, engines James had fixed the day hummed softly, the air thick with the scent of oil and fresh-cut grass. James stayed quiet, but his eyes, once dull, caught the glow of the sunset. Emily watched him and felt that her small act, that thermos on a cold day, had sparked something extraordinary. Injustice had nearly broken him, but their persistence and kindness won out. The shed wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was a testament that even after a fall, you can rise higher than before. James's story teaches that kindness can lead to trials, and injustice can wound deeper than war. But resilience and support can turn hardship into triumph. Life throws challenges, but it rewards those who overcome them.
If you enjoyed the story, drop a like and subscribe for more tales like this. Hit the bell, and we'll catch you in the next one.